Hi. I'm going to argue that you are going to be answering a lot of the big questions for evolutionary theorists. When I hear Joe talk, I think, well, of course, as Jonathan said, we disagree on very few things when it comes to how you think about the mind and culture at a very basic level. Humans are obligately social. We evolved in densely interdependent social groups, and the human mind is full of cognitive adaptations that evolve for living in groups, ones for different forms of cooperation, mating, parenting, foraging, etc. And their development and operation depends crucially on the presence of other social group members. They all have components that are designed for acquiring information, knowledge, and skills from others and transmitting it. And as heads equipped with these systems interact with one another, the representations and skills these heads acquire can accumulate in a population. When particular mental representations and public representations become widespread in a population, that gives rise to patterns of within-group similarity and between-group differences. And we use the term culture often to refer to those patterns. So the question is, why do I become uncomfortable sometimes when Joe and his colleagues talk about a second system of inheritance, cultural inheritance, and a genetic inheritance? The reason is, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, I mean it literally, the formulation, putting it that way, is mindless. It's without talking about the mind, or sometimes it is. It invites the inference that a cultural inheritance can exist, be identified, and understood without discovering the information processing architecture of the many evolved systems that generate, shape, and create culture. And I don't want to say that Joe thinks that, because I think he has been looking at those mechanisms. But there's a long history in anthropology and the social sciences where people have ignored it entirely. A view from evolutionary psychology is that the mind is not a blank slate or a content-free copy machine. It contains lots of functionally specialized programs, each well-engineered for solving a different adaptive problem. And the key thing is that many of these are content-rich and domain-specific. Like expert systems in artificial intelligence, they're equipped with concepts and inferences that may apply in one domain, but not in others. And we would learn nothing without these. These programs help to organize our experiences. They inject particular inferences, recurring concepts, and motivations into our mental life. They give us our passions. They provide cross-culturally universal frames of meaning that allow us to understand the actions and intentions of others. Sometimes they cause us to think very specific thoughts, make certain feelings, ideas, and reactions seem reasonable, interesting, memorable. So consequently, they play a key role in shaping human culture and society. So because these content-rich concepts and procedures determine what we can learn from others and the natural environment through imitation, inference, et cetera, which ideas and customs are going to spread easily from mind to mind and which will not, transmitted culture and what I'm going to call evoked culture, which situations, incentive structures, norms, rules of the game are going to be motivating and satisfy our moral intuitions, as Jonathan talks about, and therefore have something to say about why some institutions succeed and other institutions failed. For all of those reasons, it's important to understand what their information architecture is, information processing architecture is. Because cultural differences, and this is the main thing I want to get across, they can arise in many, many different ways. Seeing a difference between cultures tells you almost nothing about how it arose. Evolved mechanisms can create these patterns in a lot of ways, and you need careful experimental psychology, even if it's with weird people, to really understand these mechanisms. Of course, you should triangulate with other cultures. Joe's completely right about that. But we can learn a lot by carefully controlled experiments with weird people and with other people as well. So the problem is that without paying some attention, without paying careful attention to these evolved mechanisms, you can misunderstand the source of patterns, of these cultural patterns, of cultural differences. And so what I want to do is I want to just point out some pitfalls that can happen if you don't pay careful attention to them. So pitfall number one, it can be forgetting that some learning mechanisms are highly specialized for a specific function. This is work with Deborah Lieberman. Sorry, my slide's a little messed up here. There's an important adaptive problem. This is an example. Important adaptive problem is learning which individuals in your environment are biological siblings. It looks like the evolved solution is the evolution of a kin detection system that uses ancestrally reliable cues to compute a kinship index, a variable that reflects the probability somebody's your genetic kin. When it's high, it upregulates motivational systems regulating altruism towards siblings and sexual disgust of the kind that in Jonathan's dumbfounding experiments are so fun to watch. And one of the cues that the system uses for identifying older siblings is how long you co-resided with another child during your years 0 to 18. Now, cultural differences can arise when same learning mechanism operates in novel circumstances. So in most circumstances, you see the usual pattern you see is sexual disgust and altruism that are upregulated toward genetic kin. In the Israeli kibbutzim, people were co-residing with children who were not actually their genetic siblings. The mechanism kicked in was tagging them as siblings and upregulating sexual disgust and altruism towards the creche mates, the children they co-resided with, even though they're perfectly appropriate marriage partners. The anthropologist Robin Fox argued that cultural patterns and incest taboos track this. You see explicit incest taboos, people explicitly saying don't have sex with your siblings. Those are most common in places where siblings are raised apart. Their disgust would not have been activated when they're raised apart. In places where they're raised together, why say this? Like, do I have to tell you to not stick your hand into a public toilet? No, your disgust system has been activated. You don't need an explicit norm. Pitfall 2, assuming that imitation is a simple process that operates uniformly across domains. Imitation requires inferences, causal and otherwise, and there are a lot of different evolved systems that regulate it, and some are deeply domain-specific. I want to use an example from Annie Wertz's work with Karen Wynn that comes from realizing that we're omnivores. So how do we learn which plants are edible without poisoning ourselves? They have done beautiful work on social learning about plant foods in infants, and it turns out that there's some plant-specific social learning systems. So just briefly, you ask, the question is, what is an 18-month-old, and it turns out the same thing is for 6-month-olds, think about which food you can eat. You see the model, you have fruit on two different plants, on two different objects, a plant-like object and an artifact. The model takes a fruit from the plant-like object and goes, then takes a different fruit from the artifact and goes, Then you ask the child, which can you eat? Well, it turns out that these babies have very clear opinions. They think that you can eat the fruit that came from the plant and put in his mouth, not the one that came from the artifact. It's not an inference, it's general to actions, all actions with plant, because if he takes the fruit and puts it behind his ear, there's no consistent pattern. They don't care. If you then say, which one can you use? There's beautiful inference, there's beautiful work I can't talk about because of time by Zoe Lieberman, keep an eye out for it, that has to do with the incredibly subtle inferences that infants make about the interaction between friend and foe, what kinds of foods people eat, what they like, and disgust. Okay. Another pitfall is forgetting that some cultural patterns are evoked, not transmitted. Complex patterns can be elicited by cues such that the behavioral complexity arises from the evolved mechanism itself and not necessarily from transmitted culture. Of course, it might from transmitted culture, but not necessarily. And so I want to argue that our brains are like the Santa Barbara land shark, and especially when it comes to cooperation, which comes in many forms generated by different evolved systems. So if you're walking down the streets in Santa Barbara, you will sometimes see this, the land shark, rolling down the street. It's a tour bus, right? But then you see this. It's like, what? And on the sea, you'll see this, right? So is it a bus? Is it a boat? What is it? Well, it's the same vehicle. It has a general function, which is transport, but it contains complex machinery that generates at least two alternative modes of operation, which is triggered by information about the local environment, with the driver, of course, as its perceptual system, When it's on the street, it wheels lower, it operates as a bus. When it's on the ocean, wheels come up, there's a propeller and rudder engaged, it moves by displacing water. The experience of street versus ocean does not create these two different complex functional designs, it activates them. Well, there are a lot of different evolved programs that regulate cooperation. Risk pooling reciprocation, where the lucky share with the unlucky, and then reverse roles. Social exchange, where favors and different resources are traded. Collective action, cooperation with 3 or more individuals, not necessarily kin, to achieve a common goal and share the resulting resources. That can happen in the course of producing resources, like cooperative hunting and shelter building, also in coalitional psychology or warfare. Jonathan's paintball activation. I gotta play paintball. For science, I'm gonna play it for science. So, there was what happens in hunter-gatherer life? There's a classic study by Hilly Kaplan and Kim Hill that came out in 1985, where they were studying food sharing among Ache foragers in Paraguay. Hunter-gatherers are cooperative, but it's not an orgy of indiscriminate cooperation. There seem to be several alternative sharing rules operating even within the same cultural group in the same individuals. And for some of them, the trigger for alternative sharing rules is a perception of variance that's due to luck versus effort. So when it comes to meat, or it could be honey, anything that's a large package, but where you can be very unlucky. You can go, on 4 out of 10 hunts and not come back with meat. And it's not due to your skill necessarily, it can be just bad luck. For that sort of resource, people risk pool. They share widely, extensively at the band-wide level, closest to Marx's statement, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, sharing widely. For gathered foods where the packages are smaller and the variance is low, you see more sharing within the family and with long-term particular reciprocation partners. And then there are other goods that are shared by trade. Well, what gives rise to this pattern? Is it a culturally accumulated package of norms? Well, it could be. It could be gradually acquired via domain general imitation with trial and error leading to mutations. Or are our minds more like the Santa Barbara land shark with alternative sharing rules triggered by the experience of high versus low variance? You cannot tell by merely noting cross-cultural differences in sharing by that alone. Do you need to have experience being a hunter-gatherer? Well, what about people living in weird cultures? It turns out that Japanese and American college students, you give them a verbal lottery problem, one-shot problem on paper, they express more willingness to share high variance than low variance resources. And that's even controlling for their ideologies about distributed justice. But then, that's fine, but we can ask the question, how quickly do weird people detect resource variance and respond with sharing? Again, we can go to Hilly Kaplan and his work with Eric Schneider, Vernon Smith, and Bart Wilson. They asked, well, what happens when Southern Californians forage? Do these weird people behave like hunter-gatherers? So they made a game where people were foraging in a virtual world. They have to discover properties of the world. They're not told the properties. They're anonymous. They have a little avatar, and you can distinguish the avatar by their color. In each round, you, the subject, with your yellow avatar or your blue avatar, you decide where to forage, on the red patch or the blue patch. The red patch is a very high variance patch, but if you get something, it's a lot of calories. The blue patch, it turns out, is a low variance patch. You're sure to get something, but it's a small package of calories. You're not told that. You have to discover that. Now, you get to put resources that you capture in your own pot. It's literally a little pot, or another avatar's pot, as you choose. But there's no, and after a round of foraging, the avatars can communicate. But there's no mechanism for enforcing contracts at all. And you don't know these people personally. You don't know what their real identity is, just that they're the blue guy or the green guy. And there's 20 rounds. So does spontaneous reciprocal sharing emerge? Is it one sharing rule that goes across both patches? Or is sharing triggered by a triggered response to the high variance patch? How long does it take if that's what happens? And given an ancestral history in which men specialized more in high variance foraging, like for meat, is there any response between men, a difference between men and women in their responses? So this is the model from their data. And what you're seeing is that spontaneous reciprocal sharing emerges for the high variance resource. This is for the high variance resource for men. This is women. This is the low variance resource, men and women. It emerges even in the first round of the game. They've barely discovered the properties of the red and blue patch, and it emerges. And over rounds, it gets bigger and bigger until by the end, there's a 50-fold difference. These weird guys are sharing hugely at the end for the high variance patches only. And you are seeing a difference. It happens for both men and women. You're seeing a stronger response for men, where they're more often choosing the high variance patch and more often sharing. And this sharing is reciprocal, despite the anonymity. It is reciprocated. So even the weird people are responding immediately. They're detecting which patch is high variance, low variance. They're responding with risk pooling sharing. This is what I mean by evoked culture. It's a fingerprints of the land shark. It's a fingerprints of evoked culture, a cultural pattern that's evoked by a situation. It's triggered. And the behavioral complexity arises from the nature of the mechanism activated, not necessarily from a package of cultural norms, although those might exist as well. Now, all evolved systems regulating cooperation require mechanisms for distinguishing between reliable cooperators and cheaters or free riders. And an adaptive problem is that in a hunter-gatherer ecology, as now, there will always be people who don't contribute through no fault of their own, bad luck, injury, illness, et cetera. And you don't want to exclude those people as cooperators because they're perfectly good cooperators and you can benefit by keeping them in your social world. And it turns out we have mechanisms very richly designed for detecting potential cheaters. Some of this my colleagues and I have studied for many years in social exchange. Andy Delton has done beautiful work looking at a free rider concept for collective action problems that slices the moral domain very, very thinly. You're looking at where the mind is implicitly distinguishing between free riders and even people who steal from a group. Very subtle distinction. It's almost as if we have a grammar of sharing. These sound human. If he's a victim of an unlikely tragedy, then we should pitch in and help him out. If he spends his time loafing and living off others, then he doesn't deserve our help. These sound very weird. If he's a victim of an unlucky tragedy, then he doesn't deserve our help. Or if he spends his time loafing and living off of others, we should pitch in to help him. Kind of strange. So if these mechanisms exist in our mind, then it has implications for cultural attitudes and transmission. Political debates about homelessness, usually people are arguing about whether the people are victims of bad luck or are not trying, whether they're being lazy or bad luck. Not about what follows from that. That's barely discussed at all. Michael Bang-Peterson and his colleagues have been arguing that political attitudes in mass cultures are sometimes shaped by mechanisms like these that were designed for a small-scale social world. I'll skip this one here, but it's leading to pitfall number 4, underestimating how quickly political attitudes can change. Basically, since I have 2 minutes, I'll just say that you can have, he looks at the Danish welfare state and Americans. The stereotypes of welfare recipients differ in the two places. In Denmark, they're viewed as unlucky, and in the US as lazy. When you say nothing about the people, you get the difference in how much you oppose welfare, where Americans are imposing it more than Danes. But if you make it explicit that some of these, whether the person is motivated to get back to work and was a victim of bad luck, versus has been lazy and he could work but is choosing not to, then the cultural difference disappears. High opposition with the lazy cues in both places, low opposition with effort cues. So you can underestimate the rate of behavioral change. Some of these evolved mechanisms are designed to respond nimbly to changes in institutions, rules of the game, like whether there's punishment possible. So there are instantaneous shifts in public goods games, depending on whether punishment is there as an option or not. These are the same subjects. When possibility of punishment is taken away, cooperation declines. It's high when punishment is there. You're seeing it there too. Same thing, no punishment, punishment, no punishment. Same people, changing in an instant. You can also overestimate the within cultural stability of a pattern. So how cooperative are people in a particular culture? In experimental economics, it turns out that it's very easy. Tiny changes in framing change how people, what people do. And so can a single game let us characterize a culture? So Joe is showing his famous results, which are beautiful, and God bless him for having done this, with a dictator game. And where somebody's given a resource or told you can keep it all, you can share it, et cetera, do what you want. And a very common result is that weird people in industrialized countries, share a lot. They either keep it or they share maybe half, and there's a distribution in between. Well, is that generally true of weird people, or is it context sensitive? It turns out that you need within culture experiments to know. There's a beautiful set of experiments by John List on exactly that, where here is the standard dictator game. You get the usual result, where a lot of people give nothing, a lot of them give half. If you make a tiny change, these people have been given $5 first, and then the dictator's been given an extra $5. And instead of just saying you can give up to $5, you say you can give up to $5 or you can take $1. Here's what happens. There's a spike in people giving nothing. The people giving half goes way down. Here, so you can see the difference between the distributions. If you can give or take up to $5, there's a huge spike at taking $5 and another one at 0. And when you actually had to earn the money, mostly people just keep it. They don't give half, and some of them, and many fewer take it than before. The last point, psychologists need to inform evolutionary theory. It turns out to be very important when you're doing agent-based models of natural selection. Whether you model problems like making judgments under uncertainty. For this, I just refer you to very nice models by Andy Delton and Max Krasnow about where you take seriously the problem that in real life you have to figure out whether you're in a one-shot or repeated game. It turns out that even rational agents, evolution favors generosity, even in rational agents who think it's one shot. And different evolutionary models predict different psychological designs, especially about cooperation. It's you that's going to figure out which design we actually have, so which selection pressures have been most important in shaping our minds. So debates about the relative effects of selection pressures are going to be settled by the work that you do, by psychologists who study the design of the mind. Thanks.
Is this on? Yes. Let's pull these chairs up. All right, well, I hope you see that you've got some very, very powerful perspectives here, and you can see phenomena that you thought you understood one way are dependent on context. And there's so much we could talk about. I thought I would start by just seeing if either of you have comments for the other or questions, and then I have a question that I might ask you both.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of build off or amplify something Leda said, which in a lot of my work over the last 10 years, I really tried to combine the evoked culture perspective that she talked about with the transmitted culture perspective. So one of the things I think that's underappreciated is the degree to which social norms and institutions that get transmitted can then transmit because they evoke certain kinds of psychologies under certain circumstances. So, for example, one of the things I mentioned in my talk was normative monogamy. The power of that institution comes from how it manipulates or it evokes certain cultural patterns or has certain kinds of evolved responses. So it's a culturally transmitted set of norms, but then it works because of how it affects our psychology. Same thing's true of various kinds of political institutions. They work because they harness and tap our psychology in different ways. So I really think there's a synergy in thinking about both at the same time.
Okay, thanks. Leda, do you want to add anything? Say anything?
Ditto.
Okay. So I thought I'd ask you each a question that sort of is like a workshop this for social psychology. So suppose a social psychologist was coming to your lab So stereotyping and prejudice is one of the big areas of research in our field, and somebody was at this session, they said, wow, this looks really cool, I want to learn how to use evolutionary perspective to improve my research on stereotyping and prejudice. What would you do? Whoever, okay, ready to go?
Steve Newberg here? Steve, is it okay if I mention? Okay, so in Steve Newberg's lab, he's done amazing work on stereotyping, where he's been taking seriously the idea that developmentally different approaches to life are developed in harsh environments versus very safe environments. And he's been showing that many things that we attribute to racial prejudice seem to be activated by stereotypes that have to do with whether you're raised in a harsh or a pampered environment. And that paper, it's a lovely paper showing the power of this under many, many different conditions. And I think it's come out this week in PNAS. And so that would be an example. Another example would be that the one that I was talking about the welfare attitudes, that sometimes what's happening is the stereotype, which you have in the absence of more specific information, the way that it's functioning in your behavior is that it's activating a specific inference system that follows from it. Once you pin down the specifics of the particular case, the effect can go away. Even that huge difference that you usually see between a welfare state and the U.S. in welfare attitudes.
Okay, thanks. Joe, what would you say?
Well, I'm having trouble separating the question because I actually have a postdoc doing that.
Okay.
What she and I wanted to test that idea that I briefly described, that humans have a kind of folk sociology that's the product of genes responding to an environment that was constructed so you have different groups with different social norms marked by things like language and dress and whatnot. So we developed a set of vignette experiments, and we went to the highlands of Peru because there's an interesting setup between Quechua and Aymara speakers that allows us to tap an interesting ethnic divide, and also to Fiji, and as well as working with people in Los Angeles. And we did this work with kids and adults in these three societies. And what you find is, in at least some of the experiments, the kids are very similar. The young kids are similar in their tendency to use and make inferences based on dialect cues. But then that changes over the life course as the kids get older, so that by the time you're adults, you have very different responses to the same cues. So you can see the developmental change as the kids grow up.
Okay, so we actually do have time for some questions. The first question will go to somebody who can stand up and speak very loudly, and all subsequent questions will go to people who come up to this microphone. So does anybody have a question, and they can ask it loudly? Okay. And others, please make your way up to the microphone if you'd like to ask something.
In the Evolution of Prosociality symposium earlier, there was a discussion that I found very interesting about why we might have cultural solutions versus evolved solutions. And I was wondering if that is something that you guys have thought about. In what circumstances is it better to have a cultural adaptation that's maybe more flexible that you learn over the lifespan versus having a genetic adaptation that's built in?
Any thoughts, either? Oh, is that a yes or a no?
I want to reject the dichotomy you just made. Our information processing mechanisms that govern our prosociality they're very elegantly designed to take information from the environment and use that to regulate our generosity, our cooperation, and so forth. So I reject that as a dichotomy. Questions about which kinds of situations evoke different kind, which parts of a cultural situation are being processed by and how they're being interpreted by these mechanisms. That can be a very interesting question that can lead to far-flung cultural differences of the kind that Joe studies. And so let me hand this to Joe then.
So within dual inheritance theory, there's a class of models that look at the degree of spatial variation and the degree of temporal variation, so how much environments are changing through time and space. And I mean, to roughly summarize the results of those models, it depends on the nature of the change. So if things are going super slowly, you might as well develop a genetic response. if things are going super fast, then you also should develop a genetic response. But if they're an intermediate change rate, that you can track it with by relying on social learning over individual learning, then you should, yeah. So you should use a cultural solution.
Okay, next question. Is it, what?
This is a question for Leda again. I'm wondering if you think there are any interesting emergent properties that come from cultural learning processes that we can't understand with an evolutionary psychology models alone, and if so, what type of frameworks we can use to understand those emergent properties.
Yes, but it shouldn't be me doing it because I have other stuff I have to do. But I think one of the best examples of an emergent property is from economics, and it's the laws of supply and demand and how they set price. Price doesn't, that's not set by any, you can't reduce that to any individual head. That emerges from the spontaneous exchange among large populations of individuals, from the kinds of things they desire, the things that they want, and the things that they're willing to supply. You get the specialization of labor, which has just caused, the wealth that we're experiencing here today is caused in part by our evolved psychology for social exchange, and in part by deep specialization of labor that's allowed when there's population density reaches a certain point. So yeah, there's incredible things. And one of the things, if you look at Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist, I think he does a lovely job of putting together the evolved psychology and talking about emergent properties, exactly of the kinds that you're wondering about. So yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there one more? Yes.
It was a pleasure to see how much you agree about many of the things, and I think it left many of us kind of wanting. We came to see blood. we haven't got around to it. So let me throw something and see if it makes anyone bleed here. Joe, especially, you're good at that.
Thank you.
So what I see from Joe's work is about feedback loop. So there's an evolution processes, there are cultural processes, and they inform each other. And I find it hard to reject it. So I was wondering, how would you, Leda, address that idea of feedback loop so that the culture then affect much of the genetic and gene? Well, in a sense that, how can you suggest that those evolutionary processes are completely unaffected, and I assume you don't, by this cultural evolution? And if you don't reject it, is the difference between you really, really big enough to make anyone bleed?
Of course there's these feedback loops. I mean, we're living in a situation that's unlike anything any hunter-gatherer has ever experienced. What Joe was saying about literacy, think about the effects of the printing press, of course. I don't know to what, our evolutionary history was as hunter-gatherers as foragers of some form until relatively recently, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, to the extent that we have complex evolved adaptations that are for the modern world. I'm skeptical about that as opposed to little quantitative shifts in things. But I think where Joe and I are most likely to disagree about things is on particular explanations for particular phenomena. I don't think it's on the general perspective. It's what's happening here with group cooperation. What are the selection pressures, and what's the psychological design? Then you're going to have more differences. That's good. That's called science. That's called, we do experiments, we test it, we look cross-culturally, we look for evidence.
Yeah, I guess I agree with Leda.
But they're going to have a fist fight afterwards just to entertain you. So, okay. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Joe and Leda, and I hope you'll cite their work copiously.